All right. Well, thanks everybody for coming. We're obviously very happy to have Chris here with us. And I think most people know who Chris Wiley is. You probably don't know who I am. So I'm Cynthia Donahue. I'm the vice chair of our IP Tech and Data Group based here in the London office. And as I said, we're very happy to welcome Chris here to chat to us about Cambridge Analytica and lessons learned and potentially future aspects of law and regulation.
Cool stuff, all the good stuff. Yeah.
So Chris obviously is a data scientist. He is from Vancouver, like Elizabeth Denham, our information commissioner. And
DC represent.
Chris studied law at LSE and did a PhD in fashion trend forecasting. And he was also on the 2018 Times 100 list. So Chris, welcome and
Cheers.
Thank you. So let's start with just talking a little bit about you, about Cambridge Analytica, how you got involved.
Sure. So I'm paranoid. Can people hear me, or should I I'll just talk louder. I'll just make mental notes, talk louder. So I think I started working in the coalition government way back when, in those days. And I spent a couple years there. I then decided that I wanted to do a PhD in fashion for various reasons, because it's cool, and actually when you think about fashion and politics, they're very similar. They're all about identity, and it's like trends which you can study with a computer really well.
And unicorns.
And unicorns. And so I left working for the Lib Dems, started doing a PhD in fashion, but then I got offered a position through sort of a random chain of events at a company called SDL Group, which was a military contractor that worked for MOD and DoD in the States on information operations, which is the sort of area of military activity that looks at the domain of information around a combat situation, around a belligerent or what have you, and how can you use this information domain to gain dominance over your opponent. And they were looking for a research director who had more understanding of the internet, essentially, because at the time, DARPA, which was the U.S. military's research agency, was funding a bunch of R&D projects that essentially looked at how the proliferation of information happened online, particularly as it related to things like ISIS. And when you think about what ISIS is, it's, in marketing terms, it's a digital first or social first organization. And you look at the U.S. military, and it doesn't have that capacity. Right. Because if you're a data scientist or an engineer and you're in America or you're in Britain, you go and work at Google, you don't work for the military, because they would never hire somebody who looks like me, right? Mm-hmm. So they were lacking substantial capacity, and they're, when you look at sort of modern threats, it all starts online, whether it's through organization or whether it's proliferation of ideas or what have you. And so the research so anyway, I took this job. So I was working at a military contractor and then also studying fashion at the same time. But in my head, it all made sense. It made sense.
Well, there's a link there, propaganda.
But actually trend forecasting. Yeah. It's trend forecasting. Understand, you can talk about fashion trends as information cascades, and you can measure fashion trend. And also, when you look at fashion, is often a facet of our culture, and you can learn a lot about our culture through looking at fashion. And when you look at military objectives with, for example, ISIS, enduring cultural change is often an objective which they always fail at, but it's always listed as one of their objectives. So anyway, I started working at SCL, and the original research that we were doing was focused on these sort of mostly defensive or some offensive capabilities, but offensive in combat situations. And when you think about, and it's really important to actually make that point, because this is the crux of what Cambridge Analytica later sort of became, which is that when you think about a battle situation and you think about your belligerent, your opponent is ISIS, and what you are trying to do is undermine the organizational efficacy of that operation, and you do so through profiling, you do so through the injection of disinformation to either confuse, confound, to cause disarray or to cause paranoia within this organization, so it is not as effective at doing its job, where it starts to go into an area where you've set a trap, or where you set rumors so that it's not effective at recruiting new people, right? You set rumors so that the underlings stop listening to the leadership, right? That is what information operations is. It is one of what the military calls the 5-dimensional battle space. You've got land, air, sea, space, and information. So it is weapons. We were doing weapons research. And
so let's overlay that onto Cambridge Analytica, because obviously there's the link between SCL.
Yeah, and so what happened was, meanwhile, one of our clients who worked for the U.S. Air Force Cyber Command was on this plane in the States, and he just randomly met some of Steve Bannon's minions. And they were just they were in economy, because I guess it doesn't pay well, so they were all squished on a row. And they all, and how Americans always just chat, just hey, I'm this random person, we're sitting beside each other, so we're going to chat to each other. And it's what do you do? What do you do? Oh, I work for the Tea Party. Oh, I do cyber warfare. Oh, that's cool. Let's connect. That's literally how it happened. And so anyway, so then they go and tell Steve, oh, there's this company and we finally found the thing that you're looking for. So because at the time, Steve Bannon was the editor of Breitbart, right? And he took over after Andrew Breitbart had died. And when Andrew Breitbart, when he set it up, he created what they now call the Breitbart Doctrine, which is politics exists downstream from culture. So if you want to change anything, change the culture, don't focus on politics. And Steve was sort of set out at, creating and weaponizing a culture war, and he would use that term pointedly. It's a war. And so if you are fighting a war in culture, your domain of your battle is culture, you need weapons. You need an arsenal of tools. So that's what he was looking for.
Which brings us onto the psychology aspect.
And so he had a problem, which was that Breitbart wasn't doing its job well. Because it ended up, rather than being sort of the bastion of culture, a wave of cultural change, it just became sort of this hate blog for white dudes who can't get laid, and because that's what it is. And so he then invited at the time my boss, a guy by the name of Alexander Nix.
Right. So
Alexander flew over to New York. And he started flying over to New York a lot, and no one knew exactly what he was doing. He was just having these meetings in New York with some dude that our Air Force client introduced. So we were we don't know it.
Right.
And anyway, they essentially came to a deal, which was that they wanted to, Steve Bannon introduced Nix to Robert Mercer, who's a billionaire.
Right.
And he is an evil man, but he's a brilliant man. He has a PhD in computational linguistics, set up the first hedge fund in the 90s that used algorithms. That's how he made all of his money. And so he intuitively understood that algorithms and data can be used to predict stuff.
Right.
That's how he made his billions. And Steve realized that actually, if you want to fight a culture war, having this blog website thing isn't going to do it. You actually need a tangible arsenal of weapons. And in the cultural domain, those are informational weapons. And in the cyber domain, those are algorithms, and that's data. And so they both realized from their different sides what they actually needed, and they decided to acquire the company. And so what they did is they bought all the IP of SCL.
Yeah.
And so all of a sudden, we had this sudden change in ownership. And so we had new board, new president, all of these Americans who all of a sudden were our bosses.
Right.
And that's, when I, started to get to know Steve Bannon, because, he took over and he became Alexander's boss, right? So he was my boss's boss. And it was at that point where what the company was doing became quite problematic, because Steve started looking at the pre-existing R&D that we were doing, and profiling, and the role of profiling was just to identify our targets in a simpler way, in a scalable way.
Probably worth explaining a little bit about micro-targeting and how that works.
Yeah, sure. Cool. So the original point of what we were doing was, when you look at traditional military operations, they're like not very scalable. They require a lot of person power and a lot of people on the ground, and that also, there's risks in that. And so often what they would do is they put confederates into an organization, what you call a confederate, which is like a fake dude who goes into this organization, identifies targets of people who could potentially lead a resistance or are susceptible to, whatever. They might have a mental illness, they might have whatever, something that's exploitable, and then disseminating information to those people. But that requires you can't do that at scale. Right. And also sometimes you don't know where these people are, right? If you're looking at ISIS, it's like kind of everywhere and nowhere at the same time, except in cyberspace, where you can find it. And so the role of profiling was to essentially create an algorithmic equivalence of doing that. You use that through data, and you identify people who, for example, are more prone to paranoid thinking, more conspiratorial, etc. All of the sort of attributes that are not conducive to healthy thinking. And those would become the targets. And then relationships online would be developed with those people. Now, when you transplant that over to what Steve Bannon wanted to apply, he saw the Tea Party, and then later what we now call the alt-right, as an insurgency. And so where the US military or the British military would be trying to instigate insurgencies within terrorist organizations, he wanted to do that within the American public. And so instead, they would take these profiling algorithms and run through all this data, which they also didn't acquire lawfully, and they looked for the types of people who would be most prone to easily adopting these kind of frankly crazy ideas. So who are the lowest hanging fruits? And from that, relationships would be developed online with these people. They would be invited to join Facebook groups, for example, or pages. And one of the things that the company realized, because they were doing a lot of research on Facebook, because ISIS uses Facebook, all kinds of organizations use Facebook. Yep. And one of the things that
social media,
and other social media. But one of the things that they realized was that the algorithms, at least at the time, overtrained on certain things. So overtraining is when an algorithm essentially is too sensitive to extreme or extraneous data points. And so if you joined, a page that's like I heart the KKK, the Facebook algorithm would go, this is the thing that makes you unique from other people, so I'm going to completely alter your newsfeed to just this one thing, because it's the thing that I see as the most signal. And so they realized that if you get people to join these groups, then first of all, you start to dominate their newsfeed, and then secondly, you now have a platform to start developing a relationship. And because these are pre-profiled people, they get invited to pages or groups that match their psychological disposition, which means that a team can then start disseminating information in a highly targeted way and developing relationships. So that you would have chatbots that would sort of chat with them, and then sometimes it would be people. And once these groups got to a couple thousand people, especially the groups that would be focused on counties, like Smith County Patriots or whatever, the people that they were developing, if you're Joe Blow and you've been invited to this group and you start chatting with, Joe from out of state who's just a regular American guy, and you think like this, I think like this. It's actually we can't say it, but and once that group would get to a certain threshold, particularly in geographically focused groups, around 5% of people would actually show up to events. And so if you got to 1,000, 2,000 people, you could invite people to a local Starbucks in Smith County, right? And all of a sudden 50, 100 people would show up just to this one coffee shop. And now imagine you're that person and you're already of a disposition that is most conducive to very quickly adopting conspiracy theories. And you've been chatting with these people online in these groups, and then it's like, oh, there's an event in my local county, and you go, and it's just you see that you can't get into the shop because there's so many people. And all of a sudden, from your perspective, it's like, it isn't just me, it's like my whole community believes this, and the reason why I don't hear it on CNN or NBC or all of these is because they're all fake news, because they're trying to hide the truth, and all of these people from my community who look and sound exactly like me are speaking my truth, the truth. And what happens then is then they start self-organizing, just in the same way that the military would try to catalyze an event within an ISIS organization to get people to start organizing against their leadership, to cause chaos. You had Steve Bannon's company now organizing people to organize leadership amongst themselves in their local counties, and then it became an organic thing. What started as an online fantasy all of a sudden became real and tangible, and that's what the alt-right was. And that's what Steve Bannon was using the company to do, to set up all of these little at the beginning, micro-insurgencies in lots of these counties. And once an organic leadership forms, would then be merged together to form larger statewide organizations.
But let's talk about the data and how that was done, because obviously it's algorithms, it's micro-targeting. You know, that's very similar to what ad tech does now. But Cambridge Analytica had this extra, let's say,
layer.
Yeah.
So the psychographic. So, one of the first conversations that I had with Steve Bannon was actually about third wave feminism and intersectionality, and like Judith Butler and like the performance of identity, and that actually to view a population in terms of demographics is just inherently wrong, because like if you went down on the street, right, and I said, like, okay, let's get 100 women between 25 and 35.
Which is a normal advertising cohort.
Which is a typical target. Right? Okay, now let's put them all in a room. And the first question that I have for you is, are these women all the same people? Do they think the same? Do they have the same experiences? No. So, and it would be, if you went and spoke to just regular people, regular humans, as an typical ad targeter would, you'd be like slapped in the face, because it would be so rude to just assume that you are like every other woman I've ever seen, right? Or you are like every other white person I've ever seen, or whatever.
Every other lawyer.
Yeah, or every other lawyer that I've ever seen, right? Because you have nuance and context to your identity. And the role of psychographics was to find discrete indicators in the patterns of data that you leave online, whether it's through your web browsing or whether it's through what you like on Facebook, or the language and how you articulate yourself on things like Twitter, all leave discrete clues about how you think and how you weight information and your personality. And actually, when you think about what is the ultimate driver of behavior, it's not what's on your skin, it's not your gender, it's not all of these things. Those are influencing factors, but ultimately it starts in your brain. And so one of the things that we were looking at was, how can we create an algorithmic way of sort of replicating human intuition, right? When I talk to you, and let's say we were on a first date, right? Whatever. Okay. Lucky me.
You asking?
Lucky me. And you know, when we're on that first date, often the questions that you ask are like, oh, like what kind of music do you listen to? What kind of TV shows do you do? What do you do sport? What do you do on the weekends, right? Those questions aren't literally always about, I'm trying to match my playlist with yours, right? It's because what you're saying is creating a pattern, right? And my intuition as just a person who lives in society and has talked to lots of people and developed a mental model in my head, right, is, okay, if you listen to this kind of music, you hang out here, you do these kind of sports, I kind of get a picture of like who you are.
Right.
And I start to get to know you. And the reason I do that is so that I can, adapt how I'm conversing to you, so that I can A, respect who you are, and B, find common interests and have a great first date.
Empathy.
Yeah, empathy. And the role of algorithms was to essentially try to replicate that. Because when you go and live your life online, when you like a music page, it's like when we're on the first date and you say, oh, this is who I listen to, right? What TV shows do you watch? What sports do you do? Where do you work? Who are you as a person is all like categorized in your Facebook likes or in the things that you talk about on Twitter or the websites that you view via Google. Like these are all encapsulated. And so the role of an algorithm is to come up with that intuition so that we can have conversations that feel more natural or more human or display advertising to you that is more relevant, not based on this really artificial notion of like age times gender times income and location, but actually to really get to know who you are
in a much more nuanced way
and get trained computers on how to do that. And that can be applied in a lot of different ways. It's unfortunate that research, to put it bluntly, Cambridge Analytica conducted probably the largest ever psychological experiment that's being done on people, because our N, our sample was, in the tens of millions of people. Right?
And that's through the Facebook connections.
That's through Facebook and all kinds of other sources of data. And the problem is that when you are developing something like AI, it's like you are building this. It's like a knife, right? It's like this knife could be used to make the most brilliant meal you've ever had. It can be a weapon of murder at the same time.
Right.
And data, I think about data as sort of in the same way that I would think about like atoms of uranium, because if I put one atom of uranium in this room, it's not going to do anything. If I put a lot together, all of a sudden I can do so many things with that. It's super powerful. I can power a city. I can make a bomb. I can do cancer treatment. I can destroy a civilization, or I can save people's lives. All with the same thing, because when you concentrate it together, it becomes super powerful. The problem and this was probably the biggest failure in sort of AI ethics, because that was never ever thought about, even before Cambridge Analytica existed, when we were still doing stuff with the view that we were going to be helping the military. It was never even considered, what happens if somebody steals this?
And it's more than just somebody steals it. I also think it's related to, you've said ethics, but it's ethics and morality. So obviously what Cambridge Analytica was about was people's political perceptions and changing them to win an election. And that was the mantra, and that's what they sold. And obviously on the back of that, the EU, the UK, House of Lords, there's been lots of papers about ethics and morality and AI. And you yourself have talked about overlaying AI from a human rights perspective.
Yeah.
So let's talk about free will a little bit, and let's talk about that human rights perspective.
Sure.
And how that can be brought into AI.
Yeah. So one of the things that I'd say first to start off, because there's lots of lawyers and stuff here, is AI should not always be viewed through the lens of data protection. I actually find the whole paradigm of data protection really frustrating. AI is not data, in the same way that our conversation right now and then my memory and ability to recognize you isn't necessarily data, right? It's my ability to know, it's my ability to infer, it's my ability. And so we shouldn't, the first thing that I would say is I don't think we should be looking at AI through the lens of data protection. I think data protection gets it wrong on a lot of things. The objective is ideal, but the way it does it, I think, is wrong. But when we think about what is happening with AI, so we've got some pretty fundamental shifts coming, and I think they're coming quite soon. You literally have people. So we talk about Facebook, or we talk about whatever automated decision making and credit referencing or whatever, right? These are sort of very, very, very discrete, specific things. But we are now putting things like Alexa in our homes, right? We are putting the beginnings of AI into our, our physical space.
Yep. Wearable devices as
Wearable
well.
devices, and when you look at things like, you eat a couple times a day, you check your phone on average 150 times a day, right? You go to bed with your phone. You sleep with your phone more than you sleep with people, probably. Like, it's like,
Speak for yourself.
And so now we start to imagine what happens 5 years in the future, 10 years in the future, 20 years in the future, where our entire physical space is integrated with a digital space, and there's a layer of decision-making happening everywhere, where we no longer live in a passive environment. Our environment has motives and intentions. And that's problematic because if I have to live in a space that constantly is making decisions about me, I can no longer just walk down the road and just walk down the road. I walk down the road and everything is deciding things about me. What do I see? What buildings can I go into? What is the price of the thing? Who can I speak to? What do I even see on the screen when I order something? What news do I see? What do I hear in the morning? Google Home now has this feature where it only tells you good news in the morning if you want. Right? And it's like, so all of a sudden I turn that on and I forget about it, and now it's like I don't even know about half the stuff that's happening in the world. Right? And so and then imagine your home is all connected to various different companies where, your children, the room is watching your children and making decisions about them. When you go to the bathroom, your fucking toilet is analyzing you and then trying to understand how is it that can I use this as a piece of AI that is, that's being deployed by a company to optimize you as a consumer. That is problematic because that affects our ability to actually exercise our own individual agency, because our very environment is starting to make decisions for us, where we won't necessarily be able to say no. In the same way that I can't go and walk in a city now and say no to electricity, right? It is everywhere. It is omnipresent, right? And when I go into, but when we think about this, particularly when we start to compare it to the, through the lens of like data protection, when I walk into a building with electricity, I don't have to like click accept to terms and conditions. Right? When I go into a building, there are rules on the architecture of how that building is allowed to be constructed. The building has to have fire exits. I cannot walk into a building and say, our like UX doesn't have fire exits. Do you accept? Right? That's not allowed. Right?
Not allowed.
When you get into a car, you can't say our UX doesn't have seat belts. It doesn't have airbags. Actually, we don't have seats and we might crash into stuff. Do you accept? Right? Or not even tell you that. It's like, see terms and conditions on this website. Do you want to like open the door? Shrink wrapped, whatever you call it, shrink wrapped consent. So the way we treat other aspects of our day-to-day lives, particularly when it affects things that we don't actually have choices over, like electricity or like getting into a car, right? There are rules. There are rules
around those things.
There are rules around what you can and cannot do, and it doesn't necessarily start with user consent. There are
but we do have choices in life, and so you're right. So we can choose to drive a car, or we can choose to walk.
That's bullshit. That's bullshit. Because what you're saying, because let's actually unpack that for a second, right? Because it is very easy to sit in a corporate law office in the center of London, the sort of bastion of power and privilege, and say people have choices to not use a car. You go to rural Alabama and you tell me that you can decide to use public transit. You can't. If you want a job, you have to use that. It's not a choice. It's the same with electricity. It's the same with social media. If you want to have a functioning social life, if you want to be able to apply to a job, if you want to do anything now, you have to use the internet. You can't opt out. So it isn't, for a lot of people, when we're talking about choice, it's not like, can you technically, in sort of like an existential way, opt out of this thing? Yes, I don't have to use a car, but maybe I'll starve to death. But sure, that is my ultimate choice. I could go and walk up this building right now.
Smart fridge that already
Sorry?
Or not if you have a smart fridge that orders your food for you.
Exactly, right, sure. So the point that I'm making is that this narrative of choice I find problematic because it's not reflective to the reality of people's lives. And because people, and also I don't like the idea that we put the onus on a consumer, on a regular person to opt in or opt out of these things that they can't possibly understand in a way that we would never expect them to in any other aspect of their lives.
So let's talk about that a little bit, because obviously the GDPR, existing legislation, assumes that people are at the heart of their data and they have control, and consent is one mechanism, and the ability to object, which is it functionally an opt-out, is another. What you're saying, obviously, is because of the data environment and the network and the way things work, that those are not real choices.
No, they're not. I mean, look at, I know this is technically a slightly different piece of legislation, but look at cookies, right? How annoying are those fucking things where you just like constantly have to go like accept. I just want to see this article. I have to go like accept. Like, do we actually go and like go, and say, oh no, I want to see what cookies and what they're doing. Oh, there's like 200 things. I want this one. I don't want this one. I do want this one. I don't want that one. The problem is that opting out is always going to be more burdensome than opting in.
Absolutely.
And that's a problem because when you look at actual behavior of people, it doesn't affect their behavior. And even if they don't want certain things to happen, it's too hard. And also having these sort of blunt mechanisms like this, like the cookie directive, it doesn't do anything. It just annoys people. It doesn't protect them. And what we do is we consent wash what's happening.
So are people sleepwalking into opting in such that if to use free services, the social media, the things that we've been talking about?
They're not free. That's the thing.
Well, that's what I was just going to ask. If they're not free, do we and do our data become the commodity?
There are a couple examples in human history where aspects of people become commoditized and become products. So you've got the slave trades, you've got the sex trades, you've got the organ trade, and now we have an emerging data trade.
Okay.
And I do not say that in a flippant way, to put the data trade in these other aspects, in these other industries, which are so horrific for people. The reason we don't allow the organ trade because realistically, the most vulnerable people will be exploited in that. And when you look at what's happening with the data trade, right now, the narrative is sort of constantly looking at like, oh, but it's just for ads, right? Like, who cares? It's just for certain things, right? And the thing that I keep trying to remind people is like, think 5, 10, 20 years in the future where this data gets injected into an active environment that has motives and intentions, where the building that you go into, where your child's room has intentions. And everything about you has been fed into a room, a space, a car, a desk, a reception, a Starbucks that has intentions. And intentions about you, not as a person, but optimized as a product, as a consumer, as something to flog for money. Mm-hmm. Right? And that's scary to me because, first of all, in the purely commercial sense, optimizing human beings for commercial gain, I think, is ripe for abuse. But also, what happens? We talk about data breaches now. What happens when you've got a system breach, a network breach, a breach of your AI, where that's what it can do? That's really problematic.
Absolutely.
And that we should not be forgetting that if that's what we're doing and that's the direction that we're heading, there are bad actors everywhere in the world that would absolutely love to exploit that.
But there are also potentially good uses.
Totally.
And obviously part of the debate around morality and ethics in AI is that it has some sort of benefit for humankind.
I love data. I'm a data nerd. I'm highly critical of it because I understand how powerful it can be. Mm-hmm. Like, I was there at the most catastrophic failure of ethics in AI, probably. And so I've seen how it can go really, really, really wrong. And that's why I'm so critical. But I think that data could be the savior of human. Like, we will cure cancer because of AI. Like, we will, understanding our genetic codes will allow us to, double our lifespans, right? We will be able to fix so many problems. So when you look at CRISPR, for example, which is AI, right? It's being integrated with the codes, the actual, like, underlying data of your biological existence. And so that could do a world of good for people, right? But at the same time, understanding, like, how to mutate people could be used, in all kinds of different ways, right? Understanding how to mutate people's behavior could be used for good or for bad. And the problem is right now is that when you look at data scientists, right, or engineers, software engineers, what have you, all the people who create these kinds of products and these algorithms, like, they are one of the few professions that has such an impact on people's lives that actually has no obligation to act ethically or morally or even give due consideration to the effects on society that they have. Because when you look at lawyers, when you look at accountants, when you look at doctors, when you look at teachers, when you look at what have you, they all have professional codes of ethics that obligate them to perform their services and behave in a certain way, even if their employer tells them to do otherwise. If you're a lawyer and your firm tells you to do something that is illegal, you have an ethical obligation as a lawyer to say, I can't do that. Like, I can't do that. And the consequence for you, if you do, is not just that your firm might get fined, but you will never be able to practice law again, right? And that is never a consideration for a data scientist because there's no code of ethics for them.
Well, you've kind of addressed GDPR and essentially said in some ways it's not fit for purpose. But one of the principles or one of the articles within GDPR, of course, is privacy by design. And so,
sure, but we don't have, for example, agency by design, right? We don't obligate, and this is why data protection, I think, is looking at problems that kind of happened yesterday and not thinking, like, how is this going to be used in the future? It's about AI, it's not about data. It's about AI, it's about an algorithm. That's not data, that's different. And, we don't have, sure, privacy by design is all fine and dandy. I don't like, but, what about respecting the ability for people to make choices for themselves?
Well, that's exactly what I'm getting at. So ultimately, if privacy by design includes the morality and ethics issues, that free will, that consciousness we've been talking about, is that sufficient? Or do you think that the existing regulatory regime is just so inefficient and that law, because it tends to be reactionary rather than progressive, that ultimately your idea about standards and codes of conduct is more the way forward?
Because the way we treat, like, data protection and the regulation of tech is weird because it's like totally different from every other industry. Like, whenever data comes up as a topic or tech comes up, we sort of start assuming that, like, statutory level rules are, like, how we should address technology. In a way that when you look at, like, airline safety, like, yes, okay, there's, like, statutes that regulate, like, airlines and all of that. But when you look at, like, the bread and butter of,
don't worry.
There was a, see, the building is starting, it's knowing, it's starting to, like, figure stuff out. But, when you look at, like, all food, when you look at, whatever, the environment, all these things, there are, yes, like, statutory rules, but, like, a lot of the bread and butter and where, like, the regulatory action happens is in technically competent agencies. Like, look at, medicines regulation. It's not, we don't have, there's no GDPR for medicine. Like, medical, like, I guess there's lots of, I know that there's lots of regulations for, like, for creating medicine, but, like, they don't, if you're Pfizer, you have to deal with all these agencies, and these agencies hire people who, like, know about medicine, right, and know about drugs research. And so they can, and those are the ones who assess, like, the trials of the thing and whether that's equivalent, that is an acceptable standard. We don't have any of that for AI. We don't have any sort of agency, and frankly, we don't really have that for data protection. Like, yes, we have the ICO,
and of course, the GDPR has the data protection officer concept, which is meant to be that protector or that almost internal watchdog.
But like, I mean, usually that's the person that everybody, like, don't go to Joe in the corner. He's the guy who says no, right? It's not, you know what I mean? Like, it's not because, again, one of the things that we have to start creating is skin in the game. Like, we've got to have people understand, not, like, first of all, there needs to be a technically competent watchdog, A. It needs to also look at algorithms and AI, not just from the frame of data, because it's also about my ability to know and what I'm doing and how I'm behaving as an algorithm. But to create a culture of respect, we also need to individuate the issue for every single software engineer, for every single data scientist, and put skin in the game for them. That it's like, your legal department doesn't care because it's just like, if anything goes wrong, it'll get some £100,000 fine, whatevs, right? Because we're going to be making X billion, so whatevs, right? And it's not your problem. That's some lawyer's off, so it's but if the consequence is your company's gotten fined, now the watchdog is investigating your behavior as a professional, and the consequence might be you are going to be banned from working as a data scientist. You're going to be banned as working as a software engineer.
Essentially accountability through a standard or a code of conduct, potentially a separate AI watchdog, or some independent third party, which of course then brings us onto the topic of accountability and liability.
Yeah.
And if there's, as a data scientist, is the accountability about the outcome? So, the ethics debate is also about built-in biases to algorithms and the way decisions are made.
Yeah.
So should regulation look at the process or the outcome, or mix the two?
It has to be both. I mean, it has to be both. I think that you can't you have to encourage good behavior from the beginning in the developments, and force questions like, is the training set going to promote systemic bias in our society? Right? That should be a mandatory question that you always are asking yourself and interrogating your algorithm. Am I going to be systemically, what have I done that might have integrated bias in a harmful way? And that is both a legal question, but you can translate that into an actual statistical exploration of what the thing it is that you're doing. But also outcomes. Right? And I don't care, even if the outcome is unexpected, I don't really care. You should pay the price, even for an unexpected outcome, because you are the one making money off of this. You are the one exploiting this information and using your users. Ironically, I mean, we call them users. You are the one using them.
Right.
You are the one using your users. You're the one exploiting this information, and I don't care. The thing that I find so frustrating is some of the effects, and this is why I do think that we need to really look at regulation also just from a slightly different perspective. There is no harming our democracy, right? Is not there's no consequence for that, because it's not a technical offense. Undermining democracy is not a technical offense.
Right. There's electoral irregularities, but you're right. The undermining of democracy, yes.
Yeah. No, it's legal.
Right.
You are allowed to undermine democracy. Just think about that for a second. That's stupid. That's just stupid. That's allowed. That there's no consequence for that. So you've got a company like Facebook that literally, it does not have to have any skin in the game in the effing society that underpins its existence as a company. And it can go, and it doesn't have to care. I find that absurd. Surely this is the thing that should be most, if you harm our democracy, if you harm the social cohesion of our society, someone should be paying the price for that.
Okay. And then how about situation where all those things are thought about at the original algorithms, but of course the whole point of the AI is that it machine learns, it becomes smarter and smarter and starts to make the own decisions.
Yeah.
Right?
And this is why it is different from data. That's
Absolutely.
what you literally just said has explained why it's different from data, because it learns and it makes decisions and it starts creating. Like, it's generative. You've got something that is acting, behaving in a way on its own volition. Right? That's not data.
No, it's not.
That's behavior. That's artificial behavior. I mean, that's why it's called. It's artificial intelligence. It's artificial behavior, or arguably, it's actual behavior that affects our physical surroundings, our democracy, or what have you.
So as it does that, it becomes nigh on impossible to deconstruct it.
Yeah. Yes. 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 And that's the problem.
Exactly.
That's how it works. You can't deconstruct it. It's like asking. It's like if I said, please show me your knowledge of the word hello. Like, where in the please point to your brain where hello is, or like, hi, I want to exercise my right to be forgotten. Please forget me. Like,
not going to happen.
Like, do you still know me? Why are you still knowing me? I told you I have a right. Forget me now. Forget me.
Yeah,
like,
not possible.
It's not possible. And there are so many like situations that are going to arise where like the GDPR in all of its like good intentions just doesn't like match up with how the technology like actually works, and like and that's a problem. Like the fact, like AI, particularly, you know, if we imagine 10 years from now, 20 years from now, like you will have situations where you can't be forgotten. Like, it's a network.
You probably have those situations now.
You probably do, because when you look at like what an area of machine learning called deep learning, which is where a lot of the sort of locus of attention is right now in terms of AI research, like it is based on building what you call a connectome, which is like a sort of crude replica of the networks that you have in your brain. Which is why it's called artificial neural networks. And those networks don't, like, you can't, in the same way you can't like point to knowledge in your brain or abilities in your brain, it's very difficult to actually point to like bits of your network and say like, because the whole point of a neural net is that knowledge and intuition is an emergent property of like interconnected network. Like, where does GDPR fall in that?
But it's not just GDPR. I mean, you think about an interconnected neural network.
Yeah.
And you think the way the law is typically drafted and applied tends to be on a territorial basis. There might be some long-arm jurisdiction or some extraterritorial jurisdiction.
Yeah.
But in that AI world where there's self-creation as a result of the machine learning and that neural network, how do you think the law can tackle the fact that the information, the data that is ubiquitous?
Yeah. So we've got the internet. It's an international network. We've got treaties for things like airport codes. Like, surely we can start discussing what is allowed and not allowed on our sort of collective asset as humanity, which is the internet. We all have a stake in that, and you know, we need to, like, even things like we have arms treaties. We regulate what is allowed and not allowed from one state to another on how to attack, rules of engagement, things like that. You can't use weapons of mass destruction, right? You're not allowed to offensively use a nuclear weapon, a biological weapon, a chemical weapon. And when you look at the impact of informational weapons, right, and you look at like what is the definition of like a weapon of mass destruction? It's like a weapon that creates systemic devastation that lasts across generations, right? And you look at even what's happened in 2016. That is, in my view, the impact of a weapon of mass destruction. It was just an informational weapon of mass destruction. And when you look at it in the sort of context of like, yes, this international system that we have of like nation states and sovereignty and all of that, which develops, you know, in a pre-digital world, yeah, there's a problem. Territoriality and jurisdictionality doesn't really translate into a network.
Right.
So also in the same way, like a lot of law, even within a country, doesn't translate into a network. But we still have treaties that already regulate, at least topically regulate, all kinds of things in an international system. You know, like the network of planes flying around is regulated by treaties. So what about the network of information? And should we set some ground rules for the internet collectively as humanity for this common asset that we have? I think yes.
Mm-hmm. That brings us
although
back to...
I would be hesitant to sort of let a lot of politicians sort of like negotiate the internet, because I mean, having been in the room with a lot of them, even just understanding what it is, I've literally had a question like, where exactly is the internet stored?
I've had a question.
Yeah.
From somebody who thought Google didn't exist. They actually thought it was on the screen.
I mean, that's a very philosophical.
Yes, it could be debated in that way.
More right than I think that, you know, we can start like, and one of the things that I say is like, just because it's complicated, just because it's hard, and just because like we don't really know what the future has in store, but like there's a lot of scenarios that are reasonably possible. Mm-hmm. That we should start planning for the possibilities and eventualities of these technologies now, particularly when like this is like happening so quickly and it's going to affect people's day-to-day lives.
But in some ways, has the horse already bolted from the barn? So, you know, we're obviously microtargeting exists. You know, the way we interact with our mobiles, to go back to what you were saying earlier, and how gamification theory is used, and the whirligigs and
ludic loops. The precursor to gambling addiction.
Exactly.
It's like, you know, it's well known that if you have easy, simple, repetitive tasks that have occasional rewards, it creates an addictive environment. So if you think about slot machines, right? And then you think about swiping Instagram, right? There's research on the fact that you're using the same parts of your brain to do this, and you're using the same parts of your brain to do this. This is why millennials have this thing called FOMO, fear of missing out. It's like, because I need to keep knowing, the page never ever finishes.
Right.
Like it goes on for infinity. But I need to keep knowing what it actually is. You know, and all of a sudden that starts warping. You've got like things now, like Snapchat dysphoria, where people are going to plastic surgeons to look like a filter on Snapchat so that they can hashtag no filter, right? Mm-hmm. And, you know, you laugh, but if you think for that person, like literally this environment that they've been put into has like literally warped their perception so much that like they need to look like a fake version of them. That their digital selves is now how they see themselves, not their physical self, and this is more important. I need to start matching out. I have a problem because they don't match. I need to literally alter myself physically, permanently, to match a filter.
Mm-hmm. But that goes back to the human rights point, and your point around free will, because ultimately you're saying by using, you know, the same techniques that are used for gambling addictions for phones, mean that people aren't able to exercise free will in the way they interact with devices.
And that is the crux of the problem. That is the crux of the problem. And we look at the problems now that we have with just a bloody phone, right? And I keep saying, imagine, like, it's not your phone, it's like, imagine your whole physical space. You can't escape these things. They're everywhere. And you walk down the street, you go to the bathroom, you go to your office, you go to a store, and it's like things are constantly making decisions about you, right? If we imagine 5-10 years in the future, like, we think phones are bad. Like, imagine, like, literally where, like, the world is constantly thinking about you. And the world is constantly has objectives for you.
So we all turn into paranoid schizophrenics.
Well, but it's not about being perfect. It's like, the thing about it is that you don't know, you don't feel it, because it's very hard for somebody to stand in their environment and question the motives that environment has for them.
I think it's hard for us to do that now. I mean, all of the things that we're talking about, AI, micro-targeting, the interaction with the phone, requires the consciousness, which a lot of us voluntarily surrender in the way we already interact in our environments. Mm-hmm. And when it comes to AI, I think, ultimately, yes, we now have the consciousness and the power over how we decide to use AI. Obviously, the whole reason around Cambridge Analytica and what you've talked about before was an abuse of that.
Yeah.
So if we come back to the idea about the liability and the accountability, do you actually think that a code of conduct and these standards, which, by analogy, you talked about medical standards and things, do you think that is enough?
No, but that's a pretty easy start. Mm-hmm. Like creating a professional code of conduct that requires licensing, I think is pretty simple start. It's a start. It's not saying, and the reason why I think starting with data scientists themselves is because they're the ones who are most on the pulse of these technologies. And so they're the ones who are doing the R&D that is super top secret in these companies that you won't learn about for 2 years. Mm-hmm. But they're doing it now. And so I think it's a very simple start, but I think we need an equivalent kind of set of ground rules like the GDPR, but is specific to AI itself. Okay. And a GAIR, whatever DR, whatever it is. Yeah. Mm-hmm. We need a set of rules that is specific to the problems that will happen, or could happen, with algorithms, not data, algorithms, and decision making. And I know that the GDPR touches a bit on automated decision making, but it does it in a way that's it sort of, I read it and I go a lot of this doesn't make sense compared to what the research is where it is now. Maybe a simple regression, okay, fine, but imagine, and I think the easiest way to think about it is imagine AI as a person with motives and behaviors and all of that. And it's and if it wouldn't work for a person, it might not work for an advanced set of AI 5 years down the road.
Well, fundamentally, you said that there's no real choice, right? And of course, the GDPR, when it talks about automated processing, does not require consent. Yeah. One of the other principles around the GDPR is transparency, but yet you've said that fundamentally you think even with education and transparency around algorithms, that doesn't meet the standards.
No, because it's imagine, let's take it, rather than talking about data, let's start talking about medicine. Mm-hmm. Right? It's transparency in the molecular isomers of drugs. We should so that patients can make more informed choices. It's I mean, come on, and the thing, people should not have to be experts in everything in order to just conduct their lives. We should the onus should be on whomever is the expert and whoever is making these products. Right? Not on the consumer. The consumer should not have to know anything about anything and still be safe. I think that should be a fundamental right of people, to be able to act as they would normally act, behave as they normally would behave, and expect safety. In the same way, when I walk into a building, no one asks me, do I consent to the technology in the lift? Do I consent to the engineering standards of the building? Right? I just walk in and no one's asked me my permission for the architecture of this building, the environment that I'm in, right? Mm-hmm. It's easy to think about when it's a building. It's translate the architecture of a building as the architecture of the informational environment of a person, right? Mm-hmm. And when it's a building, or when I get on an airplane, no one asks me for my consent because it's too hard. It's too hard, and also it's kind of insane when you think about it. Why are we asking for consent? Why aren't we just creating a standard these are the terms and conditions that society says are flat out, these are the T's and C's of life. Here we go. This is what every company has to abide by, and this is what you can do, and this is what you can't do. In the same way, when you're designing an airplane, when you're designing a building, it's this is what you can do, and this is what you can't do, because this is our standard of safety for people. People, we don't ask citizens for their input on architectural standards.
Right.
Because it would be silly to. We expect, as people, that things should be safe. And so I think that when we're looking at the architectures of informational environments, that we should use the same kind of mindset. It's like, it's not about consent, it's about respect for people, and then starting from their safety and their agency. Not privacy by design, although that's important, it's agency by design.
Okay, interesting. And on that note, I think it would be nice if we could move more to the utopian rather than the dystopian experience that you had.
Sure.
I think we've got a few minutes for questions. Chris says he likes questions, so I thought if anybody wanted to ask, if you don't mind, if you could just introduce yourself, say who you are, and then.
Robert, I'm with Aspen Commodities.
Wait,
so
where are you? Oh, there you are. Hi.
I'm here. Sorry. Going off of your architecture analysis and sort of standard set of rules at a high level, where would you cast those rules? Sort of to your point, where a lovely building, full design, please look at architecture standards in terms of safety are actually very rudimentary and basic, and there are a lot of very ugly buildings that cause any number of people distress just to be in or see, right, as you drive by. What's to stop, are we going to set the standards that low, or are you going to try and make it so that companies actually have to do good?
That's up for debate in the same way that it's up for debate about, how much do we want to regulate the aesthetic of a building versus like the actual, like, it's not going to kill you kind of standard. And I'm kind of concerned at the base, like, we don't have anything for the base level. So it's like, I'm not trying to like force, I don't want a company, I'm not even talking about forcing a company to do good for the world. It's like, just don't undermine our democracy. That's like my standard. Like, I mean, that's kind of what I'm worried about right now. Don't create. Have you seen the movie WALL-E? Yeah, it's like, that is eerily like close to home as to where we might be going as a society, right? And it's like, let's avoid that. And then we can talk about like, is your building pretty, or is your system pretty, or is it good for people? It's like, let's just like start from not destroying society. And I really don't say that flippantly. I mean, like, look, everyone right now in London is freaking out about like Brexit, right? And it's like, you look at the amount of disinformation that has been put into a network of communication, right? Whether it is by bad actors domestically or bad actors abroad, and you get this impact. And I'm sure everybody here is trying to think about Brexit right now. Like, things that happen online affect our lives intimately in the physical life. And so, like, my standard is like, let's not ruin society, and then maybe we can talk moving forward about, like, I don't know, doing good for the world, but let's not ruin the world first. That kind of answers the question.
Pardon?
I don't have the news about Brexit.
All right.
This and that.
Jerry? Jerry, introduce yourself if you don't mind.
I'm Jerry Stegmeyer. I'm a partner from Washington, D.C. in the IP Tech and Day for Herbert Smith. Curious, Chris, what is your favorite science fiction movie that gives us the best sort of
we talked about
recipe
this
for
last
how
night.
to think about all this metaphor?
Well, it's funny. We were like literally.
We were talking about this last night.
No, actually, there's two movies that I recommend watching. The first one is Gattaca, because Gattaca, for people who haven't watched it, it's from the 90s when Jude Law was hot, and it was like essentially this guy who wants to be a pilot. It's in a future world where genetic engineering is the norm. He was a natural born person. And it's all about how he keeps getting denied the ability to even apply to be a pilot. Because computer says no. Like, literally, computer says no. And the whole world says no because the computer says no. And to the audience, it seems weird because it's not normalized to them right now, particularly in the 90s, that an algorithm would have the power to override anything. And he goes to Jude Law, who got into an accident, and he is genetically acceptable according to the standards of these algorithms. So he gets blood and urine and skin and all this, and it's about his journey trying to beat this sort of decision-making environment around him, where he has to literally like take skin flakes, so because the vacuum cleaners analyze everything. Everything analyzes everything, so that he can like disguise himself in genetic code terms to try to become a pilot. I think that's a really interesting movie. It's not, and what I'm talking about is not just about like genetic code. It's like all kinds of things about you as a person and profiling. And the second is a bit more of a random movie, so you may need a few glasses of wine to watch it, because it's literally like an acid trip, but it's like super fun to watch. It's The Congress with Robin Wright. And the premise of the movie is Hollywood decides that actors are not scalable enough because they're like actual people, and how could we create scalable assets in actors? So they decide to scan all the actors, acquire the IP in the act, not the person, but the actor, and then they can like make movies using these sort of like digital clones. But that's not enough. There's this great scene where one of the executives goes, we like create these fantasies and dreams in people, and we can't get royalties in people's dreams. And so they invest in a chemical company, and they then create this like what they call the chemistry formula of free will. And then the rest of the movie is this really trippy cartoon, because it's like what happens when you take it. And the end of the movie is that society gets destroyed because everybody starts essentially going into this whole just giant collective delusion. And then Hollywood moves up into these Zeppelins, and you see like LA is all destroyed, and they're just in these weird Zeppelins. But the premise of it I find is interesting, because it really sort of plays with this notion of like what's real and what's not real, and what will people do in order to like improve their sense of reality if they had the choice, even if it's not real in how we currently think about it.
And about monetization of individuals.
Oh yeah, and like the fact that there's a discussion about like royalties in dreaming is just like, of course like Hollywood wants that.
Yeah. So as Chris said, maybe 3 glasses of wine before that particular movie. We have drinks and canapes in the next room. And can everyone please join me in thanking Chris for being here and being
And also, just before I forget, so I just wanted to call it. So one of my super important lawyers, Tamsin Allen, is here. And Tamsin was like captain of the ship, rock, I don't know what to call it, through the entire process, and made sure that, the whistleblowing and the dealing with journalists and dealing with House Intelligence Committee, like parliaments, and all this that I was throughout the process safe and on good legal ground and all of that. So I just also want to like do a shout out to Tamsin, because there's a lot of people who helped me. Tamsin is one of the most important people in this story that sort of sits behind the scenes, which is the person who made sure that I was safe throughout the whole thing. So. And also my sister is here. My sister is here, and she's a great law student at LSE. So if there's any partners that are looking at like...
She's following in her brother's footsteps.
Yeah.
All right, well, please join us for drinks and canapes in the next room. Thank you, everyone.
Cheers.
Right.